Ye have heard it said that you should stop returning your tithe to the conference if they're not using the funds correctly, or if you think the leaders are full of sin. But I say unto you, not so fast. And today, I'm going to show you from Scripture why I believe that is. I promise you that I'm not going to tell you what you should do regarding your tithes and offerings, but I am going to tell you one thing that you should absolutely not do regarding your tithes and offerings. But we'll get to that later. Welcome to episode 2 of Confessions of a Present Truth Adventist. In episode 1, I addressed the concept of leaving the church because of perceived apostasy in the church. I talked about the mercy of God and the prophetic principle that we can use to determine if God will be raising up a new movement, as he did with Christianity, Protestantism, and Adventism. In that video, I mentioned the confession that I'm going to make today. However, I'm going to go into a little bit more detail. Back when I was listening to the first Present Truth ministers I ever heard, I started hearing a theme over and over again. And by the way, just a reminder, if you're familiar with my channel at all, then you know I have no problem with present truth. However, the problem I have is using present truth as a badge of honor, which I think is happening too much within our church. Anyway, back to the confession. Back in 2007, I started hearing some present truth ministers say something over and over again, and it sounded like this. If you know that the conference is using the money or the offerings for things that are against the Word of God, or if they are misappropriating funds, or if they're not using the funds properly, or, and finally, if they're not preaching the three angels' messages properly, and you continue to support them with your time and your money, then you are a partaker in their sins. When I saw that, I said, I don't want to be a partaker in anyone's sins. And so the only natural conclusion that I understood at the time would be to stop returning tithe to the conference. And for about 1 year, that's exactly what I did. I still gave my offerings to my local church, but I began returning my tithes to ministries that I believed, in my assessment, were doing God's work properly. As I said, this went on for about a year, until I had a conversation with my father and let him know my grievances and what I had been doing. Many of you don't know, but I'm actually not the only Fitzroy Anderson out there. My father's name is Fitzroy as well, making me Fitzroy Jr. And as I was talking to my father, he said to me, Junior, that's not the right thing to do. Initially, I was upset. He doesn't know what he's talking about. He's still deceived and not as enlightened as I am by present truth. And then he asked me, what if everyone in the church did what you were doing? What would happen to the church? What would happen to the worldwide work? I took some time to think about that. I took some time to cut through all of the anger I was having at the time against the conference. And after looking at the scriptures that I am about to show you, I realized that I was looking at this wrong. I'm not here to tell anyone what to do. I'm simply here to tell you why I started returning tithe again to the conference in 2008 and have never stopped since. When we're looking at these topics, it's very important that we sit down and think about what is actually being said. What is the thought? What is the principle? And the reasoning, which I have already mentioned, goes like this. God will not be pleased with us if we continue to support an institution that we believe has corrupt people in the leadership. And by the way, I don't believe everyone in leadership is corrupt. What I believe is that there are many faithful men and there are also unfaithful men in leadership. Just like there are many faithful men and unfaithful men in membership. Just like there have been times in my life where I have been faithful and other times where I have been unfaithful, because we're all human beings. And as I said in episode 1, I believe that God will deal with both sides in his time. But the focus today is on what do you do when you believe there is corruption or misappropriation of funds or apostasy or whatever it is that's taking place that's really making you upset. Is it really a no-brainer to stop supporting the conference with your tithe? To answer that question, I want you to understand what it was like in Jesus' day and what the leadership was like in Jesus' day, especially as it relates to money and corruption. In Mark chapter 7, Jesus gives a scathing rebuke to the Pharisees because they were manipulating the system to get people to violate the commandment to care for their parents in order to get the people to give their money to the temple. Basically, if someone didn't really want to support their parents, they could label a gift as Corban and give it to the church and also keep back a little for themselves. There were many that loved this system because it benefited them. This was corruption of the highest order, as it broke the familial ties and responsibilities. And Jesus knew exactly what was going on. It wasn't gossip, it wasn't conjecture, it wasn't innuendo. Jesus knew exactly what they were doing. Keep that in mind. In Matthew chapter 23, Jesus is giving his final sermon to the Pharisees. And once again, it was another scathing rebuke of the Pharisees and how they were exploiting people for money. In his sermon, he said, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you tithe the mint and dill and cumin, and have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy and faithfulness." This verse is talking about how meticulous the Pharisees were about tithing. They even required tithes on small herbs like mint, dill, and cumin. They wanted every single penny they could get, and these requirements placed a huge burden on the poor, who were already struggling to make ends meet. Now on to the next example of corruption. There are many more, but I'm only going to show you a few today. As Jesus was in the middle of giving his rebuke in Matthew chapter 23 regarding the corruption of the leadership in regards to the tithe and offerings, his eye caught something. He caught a widow who was placing her tithe or offerings into the collection plate. Jesus was very familiar with the plight of widows. Jesus was very familiar with how the Jewish leadership had exploited these widows. And he said so in Mark chapter 12, verse 40, when he said, "They devour widows' houses, and for a show make lengthy prayers. These men will be punished most severely." Once again, Jesus knew what the leadership was doing as it related to the exploitation of the people and the misappropriation of the funds, because they were enriching themselves with this money. Please keep that in mind, because I'm going to come back to that to make what I believe will be a very relevant point. The last thing I want you to see is that Jesus understood all of this very clearly. He understood that the leadership was corrupt in their handling of the tithes and offerings that were coming into the temple, or maybe I could say the storehouse. He understood that they were overcharging the people for the animals that were required for the sacrifices. The people understood it as well, and it was turning the people off and falsely misrepresenting God. Jesus understood it so much that we see him turning over the tables of the money changers and actually whipping them out of the temple. Now, Jesus was well within his rights to do this, and whether we are well within our rights to do something like that is a discussion for another day. But for now, I just want you to understand that Jesus was well aware of the corruption that was going on. As a matter of fact, back in Matthew chapter 23, he was in the middle of a sermon discussing this corruption. And yet, when he saw that widow giving all of her life savings to the system, did he go over to her and say, "You really shouldn't give your tithes to these people anymore. You should find a better ministry to give it to. Perhaps you could even support my ministry"? After all, Jesus was obviously doing the work properly. He was preaching. He was restoring health. He was teaching the people the right path to God. And yet Jesus, the only one who was doing this work properly, he wasn't even benefiting financially from it because he had nowhere to even lay his head. Not only does he not tell her to stop returning her tithes to the system, to the storehouse, to the temple, but he actually commends her for what she does and perhaps instructs his disciples later on or impresses them through the Holy Spirit to ensure that this story would be recorded for generations to come. Perhaps because he knew that there would be times in the future where his followers, like you and I, would see things that we believe are not right going on in the church. And we would be tempted to use our thinking and our reasoning to say that we will no longer support corruption or apostasy. Now, I'm not telling you what to do with your tithes and offerings, but I'm asking you to consider this story. I'm asking you to consider this context. I'm asking you to consider that those who have told you that God will not be pleased with you if you continue to support the Seventh-day Adventist Church, and I'm here to tell you today, based on these stories and this scenario, that is emphatically not true. And you can see it right here in the Desire of Ages, which talks about when the widow gave her 2 mites. It says, "Christ unsparingly condemned abuses, but he was careful not to lessen obligation." Let me repeat that. Christ unsparingly condemned abuses, but he was careful not to lessen obligation. He rebuked the selfishness that extorted and misapplied the widow's gifts. At the same time, he commended the widow who brought her offering for God's treasury. Man's abuse of the gift could not turn God's blessings from the giver. And I hope you caught that. He condemned the wrong and he commended the right. But at no point did he say that the people should make a change in the way that they were giving their tithes and offerings. Despite all of the flaws that are in the church, in the people, in you, and in me, I believe that God is a God of order. And I believe that the worldwide work of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, in its churches, in its schools, in its hospitals, in organizations like ADRA, are crucial to the worldwide organization that is necessary to spread the gospel, not just to those who have an internet connection and can just watch sermons online, not just to those who speak English, but to every nation, kindred, tongue, and people in virtually every single corner of this planet. This is why God needs an organized worldwide church. With all of our flaws and all of our imperfections and all of our wrong decisions, God is still working among his people. And while it may appear that the church is about to fall, we are told that it will not fall. It was this understanding back in 2008 that caused me to make the decision to continue supporting what I then believed, and which I still believe, is God's remnant church. I am fully aware that it has problems. I'm fully aware that everything is not done in the right way or said in the right way. However, I also believe that God will deal with whatever he needs to deal with in his time. I'm not telling you what you should do, but as you're making your decision, I'd like you to consider one more thing. I'd like you to consider one more story regarding the temple and money. The leadership had come to Peter trying to undermine Jesus' ministry, and in doing so, they asked him a question. Does your master pay the temple tax? Peter, as impetuous as he was, blurted out, of course he does. Peter didn't want Jesus to look bad in front of the leadership, and this is why he made that statement. Peter immediately left to go and talk to Jesus about this and to get the funds. And Jesus sees him coming and asks a question. He says, "What do you think, Simon? From whom do the kings of the earth take customs or taxes? From their sons or from strangers?" Peter responds, "From strangers." Jesus then says, "Then the sons are free," indicating that Jesus didn't have to pay the tax. "Nevertheless, lest we offend them, go to the sea, cast in a hook, and take the fish that comes up first. And when you have opened its mouth, you will find a piece of money. Take that and give it to them for me and you." If you don't understand what's happening here, I want to share a statement with you from the Desire of Ages to bring some clarity. It says, in the days of Christ, the priests and Levites were still regarded as especially devoted to the temple and were not required to make the annual contribution for its support. Prophets also were exempted from this payment. In requiring the tribute from Jesus, the rabbis were setting aside his claim as a prophet or teacher and were dealing with him as with any commonplace person. A refusal on his part to pay the tribute would be represented as disloyalty to the temple, while, on the other hand, the payment of it would be taken as justifying their rejection of him as a prophet. I hope you caught that. As the Messiah, Jesus did not have to pay that tax. As a matter of fact, as God, Jesus did not have to pay that tax. And yet, he looked at the situation. Jesus looked at the corruption. He looked at the fact that he didn't have to pay it. And guess what? He still paid it. And even performed a miracle to pay it. And why did he pay it? Jesus said it himself. 4 words, lest we offend them. Jesus understood that not paying that temple tax was going to do more harm than good. And I think I can safely say that making an issue of tithes and offerings today may also be doing more harm than good. Again, I'm not telling you what you should do, but I am going to tell you what you shouldn't do. You shouldn't make decisions regarding tithe and offerings based on frustration or anger with leadership. If there were ever a man that was frustrated with church leadership, it was Jesus. If there were ever a man that understood the failures of leaders, it was Jesus. And finally, if there were ever a man in ministry that was doing the work in the right way and was more than deserving of funds being reallocated to him, it was Jesus. Jesus could do what we cannot, which was to read the hearts of the leaders. We can only see actions. We cannot read intent. But Jesus was able to see both, and yet he never tried to influence anyone to not support the Jewish system. And as we saw, he commended that widow for her support, and he even performed a miracle to pay a temple tax that he did not have to pay. In other words, Jesus went above and beyond, because that's what a righteous God does. He goes above and beyond even when he knows that we are wrong. He turns the other cheek. He goes the extra mile. He gives another cloak. He makes the sun to shine on the just and the unjust. He does not retaliate. This is my message to you today. I made my decision a long time ago on this topic based on what we looked at today. And I'm sure that many of you disagree with what I'm saying, and I will respect your opinion. But I just want everyone to understand, while I am sure there are unfaithful men and women in every single conference, I am also equally sure that there are also faithful men and women in every single conference. If a wrong position is taken, or a wrong decision is made, or funds are appropriated in the wrong way, I will speak up against it, as I have, but I will also continue to support what I believe to be God's established movement, and I will trust God that he will deal with the unfaithful in his time, because as Mark says regarding this issue, that those who are corrupt and take advantage of widows will receive a greater condemnation. I promised you I wouldn't tell you what you should do, but I will tell you what you shouldn't do. You shouldn't make a decision based on what I said or someone else said. You shouldn't make a decision based in anger. Study the character of God and his dealings with you, and I will study the character of God and his dealings with me when we are not faithful. Once we understand God's patience with us, then we will know how to deal best with others. God bless.